Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to have a special guest who I already interviewed in this channel previously, Dr. Daniel Ingram, author of this beautiful book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, an unusually hardcore Dharma book. And in today's interview, I'm going to talk to Daniel about Kundalini Awakening, which seems to be a very popular topic, something that people are searching for. And what does it mean? What does it mean? It's just a label. This word, Kundalini, some type of energy. What is this experience? I think it's a very interesting topic. So, Daniel, what do you think about Kundalini Awakening? What does it mean for you? Let's start with this question. What is Kundalini Awakening? What do you think about it?
It's a gigantic topic that I end up speaking with people probably at least once a week about, or relating to people in some way, because I still talk to a reasonable number of people about their meditative practice. It's huge. It comes up all the time. It's poorly understood by the Western clinical world and mainstream world. These are real effects that are very powerful sometimes, and there's endless debates about what to do about them or with them or how to cultivate them, or if it's dangerous or if it's really important or if it's necessary or if it's healing or if it's scary, and it can be all of those things. Um, and how it relates to the maps and stages of awakening is a controversial topic that I deal with all the time, and what to call each of these things, and how this relates to other traditions. Do people run into the same phenomena in, say, like, Catholic meditation, or is it a totally different phenomena, or just is it just all, sort of perennialism versus, yeah, debates about whether or not this is specific to certain traditions or practices, or just a universal phenomena. I myself ran into some of this stuff before I knew what the word was, or had any techniques to deal with it or frameworks. So I think it's more universal, but other people disagree. So those are some of the many controversies that I run into around this. And we could send this conversation a lot of different directions depending on what you want to talk about. So that's a sort of a broad overview, but that's not even anything like complete. But it is a fascinating topic.
So, why don't we start with a little definition? So, how do you define a Kundalini Awakening experience? It's just a word. How do we define it? And I know that you use a particular model coming from the path of purification or the Visuddhimagga, and they tend to call, or that's what we think, that they tend to call this experience the arising and passing away, or the fourth stage of insight. What do you think about that?
So I have used something of a hybrid map system that is a mix of lots of different map systems. And in the general band of spiritual peak experiences, which I usually call the arising and passing away, or ANP, and again, this is controversial of the people from the tradition who say, no, that only happens to certain Theravada practitioners on retreat. But I, for my own phenomenological reasons, like to lump into that category of what I call the ANP, stuff related to Kundalini openings, blissful energy, these powerful, spontaneous movements, bright white lights, seeing or feeling energy channels. And someone might have none of those, a few of those, or all of those. And it might be dramatic and profound, or it might be relatively subtle. One of the times I think I crossed this, literally, I felt this little quick zip of energy. This one, zip, sort of down the middle of my spine. That was the entire thing, right? That was my whole A&P event. It wasn't dramatic beyond that. Literally just took a few seconds and was relatively small. And I've had other times where I shook and sweated for days and had all these crazy changes in consciousness, and, massive rapture and bliss and openings to unitive divine wonder, and, plunging down to the depths of, disappearance and all kinds of wild stuff. And, and all kinds of other variants. And I've talked over the years to thousands of people who've been going through this and gotten to learn something of the wide range of amazing phenomenology that's out there in terms of what can actually happen to people and what they describe. And it's a huge thing, right? I mean, this has been the subject of whole large long books and even entire meditative traditions, and rightfully so, because it's a huge topic. So
So, do you think it's useful in your experience to figure it out, to understand, was this a Kundalini Awakening experience or was it not? This experience that I had, does it match the criteria? Do you think it's useful for people to understand or to try to figure out whether an experience they had is a Kundalini Awakening experience?
So when you start applying maps and labels, then the question is, does the map or label help you do something? So the first thing a map or a label might do is it gives you a way to talk about or internally think about it through the sort of linear thought stream of what's going on with you. like when I was a kid, I didn't have any words for this stuff, and I ran into the words about 10 years later. And then it was like, oh, that was this thing. And suddenly having a word for it, that I found pretty helpful, actually. And then not only did it, like I found a word, I found, wow, they actually seem to think this is part of a standard developmental progression. So there was some normalization. I've personally found that normalization extremely helpful, and have met, lots and lots of other people who did as well. So I think, so A, just being able to use the linear narrative thought stream and that kind of operationalizing of something can be very helpful. Then the normalization that this is something that happens to somebody other than you. I mean, I've met people who had never heard of this happening to anyone, and it started happening to them. And then it was super confusing. They thought they might be going crazy, or had some like seizures, or had some movement disorder, or they weren't sure what was going on, but it was freaking them out. And then as soon as there was like a normalizing label that had some sort of overlay of maybe some positive aspects, or potentially very positive aspects, that could be very helpful, as well as warnings like, hey, this can get out of control and cause some trouble and some challenges, which it can sometimes. So they got, they got out of the realm of just their sort of confused, non-labely fears and sense of being a freak or something, into the realm of, oh, other people have had this. There's a community I connect with. There's a body of writings and technology. And even if, when you look up Kundalini on the internet, you're going to get 1,000 wild opinions, or millions probably. You're going to get a lot of wild opinions. Still, at least they were now part of a conversation that they could be sorting out, rather than being a confused lone wanderer that thought they were broken and whatever. So in terms of that, I think just having a label can be very, very helpful. And the problems with the label, though, is it's obviously in some ways proprietary to certain sort of Vedantic or, traditions and so then the question is, how does that work with your own tradition? If you're coming this from like, one of the Abrahamic religions, or some other religion, or a scientific materialist that might not like words like Kundalini because it seems too woo-woo or something, right? So any language or term that you use is going to create a variety of responses in different people. But even having language for it at all, and being able to maybe translate it into something that works for you, like a divine rapture, or being touched by the spirit, or whatever your tradition's word is, rising and passing away is the term I tend to use, or whatever your tradition's language is that you're comfortable with. Or if you're coming from a tradition that has no language for this, like scientific materialism doesn't have good words except maybe exploding head syndrome or spasmodic torticollis, or some of the ways this gets medicalized, right? At least having something that you can then attempt to translate into your language, I think that is an upgrade for most people. Right. So these are my thoughts on having the word. And then even more than that, connecting with the vast body of literature of how to potentially cultivate the effects that you want, how to mitigate the effects that you don't, and then how to turn this into opportunities for growth, transformation, healing, and all the cool stuff that Kundalini can do, opening up your perceptual thresholds to new possible ways of perceiving the fine minutia of experiential reality, opening yourself to whatever you want to call the energy body, or the chakras, or nadis, or, pick your favorite language for this stuff. Lung or chi, right? So, lots of different language for this. At least having that opening into that world of the debate and discussion, I think is huge. So those are, at least from my own experience and lots of people I've chatted with. So those are reasons I think it's important to have the potential to say, hey, does a term like Kundalini work for me? And at least have the optionality and all the maps and controversy around it. Is that something that's useful for me? For a lot of people, even as weird as that journey can be, it is. So.
Okay, so what do you think is the most important elements or details when someone wants to figure out, was this a Kundalini experience, Kundalini Awakening experience, or was it something else? How do we start to decipher this?
Well, coming from dual worlds, right? So I come from the medical world, right? I had this MD. Remember, this is what I'm about to say next is just one dude's opinion on the internet, not professional medical advice for you, right? So take it with a grain of salt, consult your local medical providers, and all appropriate disclaimers thereby. But the doctor in me is always thinking about other stuff, right? Did you have a seizure? Right? Did you have a temporal lobe something? Is your electrolytes or potassium out of whack? Or is there something else causing this? Do you have hypocalcemia that's causing some weird muscle tetany or some other medical problem? Like, there are medical things that can look like this stuff, right? And exactly the differential diagnosis. So if you go to a mainstream medical practitioner, unless they're a very unusual one, they're not going to be able to hold or will not have been trained in the vast differential of medical stuff and Kundalini stuff, right? That's a rare dual skill set, unfortunately, at this time. The EPRC project that I'm working on hopes to remedy that with good, solid clinical research and reasonable differential diagnoses of what this could all be. But remember, there are medical conditions that can cause things that may not be Kundalini. They may just be something medical. And where exactly how these things overlap and what's the Venn diagram of differentiating them is not entirely clear. I personally am pretty sure that medical diagnoses like exploding head syndrome are just straightforwardly Kundalini. Like, I think it's just kind of another name for one of the variants of that. That's just my personal opinion. But, it would be good to have some good research to sort of help to validate these ways of using conceptual frameworks and diagnostic frameworks to help people. Um, so, yeah, but so just remember there are medical things. Don't neglect those. And whether or not you want to see a doctor, you might want to be careful about saying words like Kundalini, because there's some people who just think you're totally crazy or psychotic or like, having religious delusions, right? So that's a real fear. But if you can find a clinician who's competent and not needlessly attempting to pathologize spirituality, then, if like you're having some strange stuff, like is a medical workup totally unreasonable? I don't know. You're going to have to make that decision for yourself. But realize there are medical conditions that can cause strange shaking and muscle spasms and weird alterations of perception and stuff. Okay, that's a thing. And then there's the whole question of substances, right? So like the number of people who I've run into who took some MDMA and seemed to run into this territory, or some psilocybin or other things, DMT, a bunch of different substances, LSD, obviously, salvia, 5-MeO, maybe. That's a complicated one of what stages that leads to, but it certainly leads to something powerful in a reasonable number of individuals who think they cross that territory that way. And that can sort of make this whole diagnostic things much more complicated, right? And then there's the question of, like, assuming you don't have some medical thing, then there's the question of, if you make this diagnosis, like, whose criteria are you going to use? Right. So it's not like there's a perfectly fixed, standardized set of criteria, exactly what Kundalini is. And we can know for certain this is the optimal framework for all people at all times to use in terms of how you differentiate what is Kundalini and what isn't. We don't have that. We have various ancient, somewhat competing traditions coming up to us. If you want to broaden this out to include all the Qi literature, which is, there's extensive Chinese literature on this, Tibetan, Nepalese, and Indian, other literatures and technology that comes out of the Theravada. You can find stuff in Sri Lanka. And then you find stuff in the Western traditions, or more sort of Middle Eastern, sort of like Western Asian traditions, right? You can find stuff about this in Sufi dancing and people whirling around and getting into these ecstatic states, right? And so to what degree do you want to be something of a perennialist like I am, and take basically all the spiritual highs and kind of lump them into this general basket, like with some differentiation depending on exactly which one is going on? Or do you want to keep this all proprietary and no, I was doing a Christian prayer, it must be a Christian thing, it can't be a Kundalini thing, given regardless of the fact that there has to be some sort of rough clinical perennialism? And by that I mean there's only so many pathways by which your limbs can spontaneously shake and you can see a bright white light. The neural pathways that can do that are pretty limited, right? Or maybe singular. And so the question is, what kind of rough clinical perennialism versus proprietary tradition thing do you personally want to apply? Because people at different points in their spiritual journey might be more or less loyal to traditions, or have more or less of a sense of a zealous fervor about their own tradition. One of the curious things about Kundalini territory, as I lump it into the big basket of the arising and passing away as my shorthand, is that people can become very zealous and excited about their particular tradition. And so weirdly enough, the very phenomena which of the basket of zealousness that tends to come with being super excited about, they were touched by a particular guru and shuddered through their whole body, and they fell to the ground crying and seeing divine, spirits, blessing them with radiant nectar or something. And now they associate it with that particular guru or faith healer or substance or whatever they took, right? That very singular focus then that the profound feelings can engender in an individual can also then, in some ways, through that zealousness and fixation on that tradition, exclude them from drawing on the wide range of literature that comes to us from lots of traditions that have been thinking very thoughtfully about how to cultivate the good, leave off the bad, and deal with the weird, right? So that's one of the other issues that people run into. I've been talking a lot. What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so you mentioned, shaking, bright lights. That was not necessarily the type of experiences that I was experiencing when it comes to this stage of the practice.
Yeah, so it's just one of some of the cliches, right? I bring these things up, but there's it's obviously a huge range of phenomena. You want to talk about some of your own experience and what you thought of Kundalini?
Yeah, so first experience was on the third day of a 10-day silent Vipassana retreat. I remember sitting there for 2 hours without moving, feeling like, wow, I really need to like power through this experience. There was a lot of pain throughout the body. I was sitting, meditating um, in stillness for 2 hours. And I remember that there was some kind of dissolution. The whole structure of pain dissolved. It turned into energies. And I remember opening my eyes. And there was some visual, qualitative difference in the way the reality was perceived. So I could somehow, I had this strong sense that there was something really good to be experienced or attained by continuing this meditation of the Vipassana practice. And this visual quality of seeing humans walk around, something changed. I was not taking it for granted so much anymore. There was some kind of mystical quality to the visual perceptive reality. But this was just the first time I experienced what we like to call Kundalini Awakening. The second time was on, I think, the fourth Vipassana retreat that I've done. And I remember, again, there was this whole dissolution of the body into fine, fine vibrations, as Goenka likes to call it. It was extremely pleasant. And yeah, obviously that experience didn't last.
Yeah, so you were saying you described the phenomenology of visual alteration and increased appreciation of the fine-grained vibratory or particulate or something nature, wave particle stuff of bodily experience, an increased sense of faith and possibility, enhanced perception, or those fair descriptions of what you ran into in this territory.
Yeah, and another important feature of that experience, I feel and remember that it was this intense commitment to the spiritual path. It felt as if meditation, spiritual practice is the most important thing, and somehow I deprioritized everything else in my life. And this happened exactly after this Kundalini Awakening experience, or what we call the arising and passing away.
Yeah, I mean, I very much think of this as like the onset of spiritual adolescence or puberty is the way I look at this line, which again I call the ANP or Kundalini openings or awakenings or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, people are not the same after that. It's kind of like entering adolescence. There's this whole new set of challenges, perceptual modes, access to things, and yet difficulties. Right? It can raise complicated existential issues. It can enter the territory. If you look at sort of maps I'm familiar with and tend to see a lot of utility in, even if they're not perfect, is that after the spiritual highs will come some spiritual lows, and then eventually you can get to some sort of open, expansive, balanced spiritual plateaus of the arising and passing away dark night equanimity cycle, or however you want to think about it. Now we have to be careful here of the reasonable critic saying, oh, you're scripting people into some stuff, and is scripting impossible? No, scripting sometimes can happen, but these are also patterns that have been noticed again and again by people other than me, and you can find in a whole bunch of these books up here, if this has been noted for thousands of years, that there's some kind of a pattern like this in plenty of contemporary books as well, like the excellent chapters 9 and 10 in A Path with Heart by Jack Cornfield, or plenty of other cool manuals, or the Visuddhimagga and Vimudimagga, some of the commentarial traditions, the Abhidhamma of the Theravada, and plenty of Kundalini frameworks, as well as classic stuff and Western things like the hero's journey of the suddenly opening to their power and then the plunging into the underworld and eventually coming to some sort of broader transformative balance around this whole thing. Right. So you see these themes again and again and again playing out in literature and human drama, in descriptions of people's mystical journeys. Um, and so so yeah, there's danger in scripting, and there's also, you've got to recognize that the timing and the intensity of these things can vary widely, and there's debates about like, are only the most intense arising and passing aways or Kundalini openings or whatever really the meaningful ones, where I've had some ones that were very, very small and very, very short that still seem to do the thing that it does, which is lead me on to next stages in my own life, practice, emotions, experience. And so just recognize, if you're listening to this, the range of presentation of these can be extremely wide with varying phenomena, all of which may or may not apply to you. And the timing, some of these things can be really short, like literally seconds, or can go on for months. I know people who they went up into the highs of peak experience or Kundalini opening or whatever, and they were there for months, flying high as kites with energetic stuff, the sense of powers and ability to see auras and chakras, know things, like super creativity, kind of very manic kind of looking. And then, and then similarly, the dark stuff, which for some may follow. Not everybody can be very short and very mild, hardly noticeable, or it can be longer, unfortunately, or very dramatic, very challenging. And that can vary by the cycle. So this isn't like a linear cycle where you cross the ANP once or Kundalini and get into the challenging territory and then get to a plateau. People can cycle around and around and around at various levels of intensity, kind of like a fractal, where you just see the pattern in big cycles and little cycles within a meditation sit, within that day, within a retreat, within those months, within that years. You can see all these little cycles and big cycles. So if you're going to enter into this territory, having some sense of something of the fractal nature of this, where you can get highs and lows kind of adding to each other in complicated ways. And this is a long topic that I spend a lot of time talking about, and just realized that there's no way we can cover anything like the depths of it in a relatively short podcast. But just realize there's a lot out there to think about.
Yes, I remember in the Vipassana monastery, in the meditation center that I was practicing a lot of my long retreats, we used to talk about something called the 10 corruptions of insight, meaning like these very positive qualities that come up but actually hinder you from progressing in your practice, particularly in this stage of the practice of Kundalini Awakening.
Yeah, so the 10 corruptions of insight are all these extremely positive factors, things like equanimity and rapture and faith and, increased investigation and energy, all these things that are amazing. Right. So for the people where this Kundalini opening stuff is really positive, which again is not everyone, there's some people who find it very challenging or scary or painful, right? It can have all these weird qualities to it that are not so much fun. But for those who find it fun, like the highs can be really high. And some people will just take those highs and build and build and build on them and like really take off on the runway to challenging to territory that by being so up is very challenging. They may not sleep for days, or they may have all these, complicated ups. But let's see here. Where was I going with that? So I think the important thing to recognize is that if this starts happening to you, like having an ability to moderate your own energy and moderate your practice and really titrate the dose, figuring out what is too much is something of an Icarus-like project, where sometimes we don't know what is too much until we've flown so high that our wings start to melt. Other people will not fly that high at all. There's a wide range in sort of how prone people are to the wild highs and lows of the spiritual path, sort of more cyclothymic from a kind of a pathological point of view. But for people who have access to the ups, the real ups, and the things like when you say, how do you know, right? So from my point of view, like things that I think are pathognomonic, like if someone says these things, there's no way I'm not going to think they're in this territory. Okay. If someone says, I know you haven't seen this one, but a lot of people do. I just saw this bright white light or these bright jewel tone sparkles. It was so bright. I was seeing these colors on the backs of my eyelids, or even with their eyes open. I just think of this territory. Like that's the only thing I think about. I think this is that territory. If someone says to me, I was suddenly able to sit for like 4 hours without any pain at all. Like, and I'm going to think about this territory. If someone says anything vortex, if they say vortex to me, they had a vortex of energy or a cone of energy or swirling energy in their body, I'm going to think of this, period. Like it's almost pathognomonic for me. If someone says, I was on this meditation retreat and it was super painful and all of a sudden it wasn't, and I felt like I could really practice and my mind was suddenly so concentrated and now I got what they were talking about and why they do this, particularly around days 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, like it just is a cliche, but it could happen earlier or later. But I'm going to suddenly think about this territory. Like all my knee and back pain was gone. Suddenly my posture was incredible and my mind could just super focus. If someone starts talking about energy at all, they're like, all of a sudden I could see my body as vibrations or particles, right? Or like it was fine-grained ability to see all these little super nuanced things that were just showing themselves to me naturally. That quality of suddenly, rather than you having to effortfully do the meditation is suddenly effortlessly doing you. In the tradition I come from, which is this weird sort of fusion tradition, we talk about like second vipassana jhana. With the dropping of applied and sustained effort, there's increased rapture, happiness, and concentration, born of this natural competence of, strong concentration or whatever. So we think about that. If suddenly someone starts talking about, oh my golly, I suddenly had powers, like all of a sudden I could see other people's energy or my own energy, or know what people were thinking, or anticipate what people were going to say right before they said it, I'm going to think about this territory, the same kind of basket. If someone suddenly said, I've all of a sudden traveled out of body for the first time, it was just amazing, and I I'm suddenly thinking about this territory. And so again, I'm something of a basket perennialist, because for me, functionally, this is all kind of like the same neighborhood, even if you don't want to break it up the same way. If suddenly someone said to me, all of a sudden I was filled with a sense of divine love and bliss that was just off the scale, or even just moderate grade, or if anybody says the word orgasmic to me, I just think about this territory. Like it was just bliss like an orgasm. I'm just, okay, this sounds like that territory to me. But again, I'm something of a rough clinical perennialist. Some people may disagree. Sudden, spontaneous, shuddery movements, weird asymmetries of posture that suddenly correct, the sense of like energetic knots that all of a sudden are breaking up and dissolving in that energetic sort of quality. These are all things that make me think about this territory. This is obviously nothing resembling a complete list. Oh yes, the zealousness of all of a sudden I had seen the light. I'd been touched by the Spirit. I had a conversion experience where all of a sudden Jesus had come into my heart and just blown me open. The sense of chakral openings, by the way, in that same start, someone says like my heart chakra, it felt like it exploded. Anything explodey, my head exploded. The world exploded into energy. Like any of that kind of stuff. If someone says that to me, I personally, again, my mapping system, you don't have to use it or like it, but I think about this general territory, right? So that's not a complete list, but that at least is a basis of conversation and discussion. And at some point, by the way, we should talk about the dark sides, right? Because for some point, Kundalini is not fun. If someone says, all of a sudden my arms were flapping and I couldn't control it, or I suddenly had this extremely weird spasmodic jaw stuff or neck stuff going on, like I just like was like this, or like something was really messing with my walking. When I tried to walk, my steps were so uneven or bizarre or jerky, or something like that. I'm also thinking about this territory. And for some people, these energetic openings are frightening, horrifying, very painful. Like they do not like it. Whereas for most people, it's pleasurable, amazing, awesome, incredible. There's a small subset for whom no. Like this is like, it's painful, it's horrible, it's challenging, it's shuddery, it feels violating, or like something is horribly wrong with their musculoskeletal system. Again, there's other medical stuff that can do this. Make sure you're hydrated and your potassium, calcium, and other stuff. Like, do you need an EEG to make sure you're not having a seizure? I don't know. You talk with your doctor, or hopefully someone who has dual knowledge of this, if you can possibly find one. It's a whole separate question. But for those who don't have some other medically thing going on, their electrolytes and everything are fine. That's not a complete differential. Like this stuff can sometimes be really challenging, in which case then the question is how to deal with it skillfully. That's a whole nother topic. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something about what I was talking about earlier with regard to the pleasant stuff.
Yeah, so I think what comes up for me is more the thought about the priority, how this affects one's life priorities, which is what I found in my life. Once I crossed this territory once, or the second or third time, it always had this shift of priorities where I was like, spirituality, spiritual development, most important thing, relationships, work, money, all this stuff takes a back burner because life is ending and I have to focus on this thing. And I found this priority shift was always tied into that shift for me. So that's what comes up for me. This kind of how these experiences tend to shift the focus in one's life, and then end up focusing on spiritual development to the detriment of other aspects of life, or to the detriment of developing a more holistic personality, let's say.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. That's that zealousness, that conversion, that touch by the Spirit, that you're never the same again, that entering in spiritual adolescence, or spiritual puberty or whatever you call it, that sense that can then come of wanting to renounce the world and go into practice, devote your life to the path or the guru or the tradition, to go off on retreats, to wreck your finances. This can then get into the dark territory after it. So, right, as just as thunder follows lightning, if the lightning is the Kundalini, the thunder being the dark night that follows it, or the challenging experiences for some non-zero number of people, which might be a significant number, then suddenly that increased sense of dissatisfaction with life stuff. So you get both things. You get both the increased attraction of spiritual practices or yoga or psychedelics or whatever it was that got you into this territory. People then tend to have a special place in their heart for, right? They tend to like it, particularly if it was pleasant or very profound, right? So they generally want to do more of that. And then by comparison, the sense of renunciation that can come after that, or disappointment or disgust or misery or fear, paranoia, lack of interest, lack of appreciation of partners, jobs, school, education, family, community, even the tradition that they were in before, their previous religion or spiritual tradition. This can be extremely disruptive. It can be simultaneously very inspiring to potentially do something really cool if it ends up really benefiting you, okay, but can also be very disruptive, even destructive to people's lives. And then I know a non-trivial number of people who got into seriously bad territory on the dark, other side of this, where they then were suicidal or actually killed themselves. Real tragedies, unfortunately. I've known some of these people. So just recognizing that there is this other side to it, which is not fun, or sort of spiritual madness, divine crazy, going into real challenging territory, right? Which is one of the things the EPRC is working on researching, and related to all of this is how best to deal with that in a clinical context. And the problem is we have a whole mainstream clinical world that basically has no other answer but you're crazy and you need meds. And we largely have families and traditions that tend to value a high degree of career function and responsibility to family and career advancement and all of that, children, etc., rather than going off on your spiritual quest, unless you're coming from a very unusual tradition or family or religious group. And so that conflict it can go on for years or decades. And like my life spun off in a number of important directions because of these things kind of tossing me around. And even once I knew about them, was not immune to the effects of them. And those effects ended up working out well, but that's not always the case. Right. So this obviously gets very, very complicated. Yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking also what came up for me is having a conversation with someone recently. What do you think is like the relation? This is a challenging one between what we call Kundalini Awakening, which is a particular stage of spiritual development, and Kundalini energy. So I don't know. I met this girl and she was telling me I'm a energy healer and I work with Kundalini energy. And so for me, it was like, okay, interesting. It's the label. This word Kundalini they use. What does that actually mean? And I found that challenging to relate these two elements.
Well, so if you think of Kundalini Awakening as an event or a threshold or a thing that you cross, like, and then the energy itself, that kind of band of experience, right? So if you take the sort of second vipassana jhana, arising and passing away, Kundalini, whatever you want to call it, territory as a band of experience that can be focused on, cultivated, and worked with, that is the band at which people tend to feel channels, sometimes be able to manipulate them, sometimes feel them in others, be able to manipulate those. And there are people who, either through their own proclivities, tendencies, training, inclinations, or some mix of elements we don't understand, that is the band of experience that they tend to gravitate towards, focus on, and find very interesting. And particularly in body workers and energy healers and people do craniosacral stuff and other types of workers in that territory, that's where they focus. And you can cultivate this as an intentional way of working. So working with chi or lung or energy or whatever you want to call it, nadis, channels. There are whole branches of healing traditions that's just the band they focus on, and that's what they're interested in. And so, like some of us are tourists, where like when we're in those stages, like when I was in those stages, certain times I could see and feel and manipulate channels in myself and occasionally even in other people. Whereas I'm something of a tourist, there are people who are kind of natives or that sort of become natives. They become naturalized to that territory by cultivating it. and they just learn how to stay there, to tune to that, and to work with that, not as a thing that they cross and are then on to new territory, but as a band that they focus on as a primary healing modality, way of relating to their own bodies and the bodies and energy systems of others, or even of communities, or even of the planet, right? This can get kind of broad and pretty expansive, or other species or entities, right? They can tune into this kind of as a mode that they really work with. So I think that's how I would differentiate those two things. Thoughts?
I find that there's no longer this kind of whereas in the beginning, when I would cross this territory, it always carried this kind of shift of priority, shift of perspective, and this impressive kind of newness element to it. It somehow it lost that after having crossed it again and again and again. Somehow the features of it became more familiar, and it became less of more normalized and more noticing the qualities of the excitement and the particular focus and illusion that comes with that territory. Somehow it became more normalized as opposed to something that continuously, like it's like if you ride the same ride again and again, at some point it loses its impressiveness or its ability to delude you in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. That so again, that's the sort of naturalization of, we start off as tourists or accidental tourists, where we cross into this territory maybe intentionally or totally unintentionally, sometimes even as kids, right? I know people who as kids started entering this territory with no practices at all, and I know people who spent years chasing this territory on intensive retreats and doing all kinds of practices and never got into it. And why that is, I don't know. But it is definitely true that the more times you cross this stuff, or the more you focus on it, or the more times you get into it, then the more accessible, normalized, yet you can become something of a naturalized citizen rather than an accidental tourist. And so that's a pretty common progression of people who do a lot of this stuff. And even for some people, just if they don't, that's just the way they were built, their natural tendencies and gifts.
And what about in terms of actual practicalities, moving away from that territory, from this territory of crossing the arising and passing away, or the Kundalini Awakening, and then working with the more challenging aspects of experience, which tend to bring up this feeling of like, I'm doing this totally wrong. I don't know what happened. I lost it. I was awakened. Now I'm not. And yeah, the challenges that come afterwards, which can bring up so much dark stuff into one's awareness, that becomes very challenging to work with if you don't have somebody who tells you, actually, you're doing a really good job. Now your challenge is to focus on this. Yeah.
Yeah, first, the thing you mentioned, the normalization that after spiritual highs might come spiritual lows, that after a high degree of spiritual power or competence, the ability to sit for hours or dissect reality into fine grained things or see channels or have this amazing bliss, there might come a loss of all that, and even what feels like a profound regression, or even diving into darker territory than people have ever been in. Just the fact that that happens for some, that cycle is very empowering. So once you get past the simple fact of normalization, then there are endless debates about how you best deal with that territory, right? Should you be doing focusing broadly? Should you be opening your eyes? Should you be grounding in the body and the breath? Should you be cultivating positive factors? Should you be plunging into your darkness? Should you be, like being more social and hanging out with friends, integrating in the community, like versus, doing long solitary retreats, working on your karma for the next life? Or should you be going for, deeper levels of awakening now? These are sort of endless debates. Should you be, relying on the divine grace of your deity or guru, or should you be, cultivating high degree of technical competence such that you can shift intentionally to next stages, right? These are all kinds of debates that flip, whole community, that actually can tear apart whole communities and have caused a lot of division among people. But just realize there are a lot of ways to play this. I myself, who have talked to thousands of people and read thousands of posts of people dealing with this, have seen a lot of things work. So that's the interesting thing. There are an extremely wide range of things that can sometimes work for certain people at certain times in their practice. Will they work for you? I don't know. But at least having the optionality and the ability to explore and experiment and see what actually helps you can be very useful in recognizing that there is a lot out there of reasonable advice in this territory, some of which seems apparently contradictory and a lot of which can work. That's why people are replicating it. Is sort of part of the fun and the adventure. At the moment, we don't know optimal strategies for predicting exactly the best way to deal with it for you. One of the things I hope that the EPRC researchers are able to come up with is reasonable predictive strategies of what is likely to be best for someone based on their, sense door proclivities, or the particular religious traditions they resonate best with, or something in their epigenetics or biomarkers, or what is it going to be that where we know actually for your particular case this is the most optimal strategy for a soft landing, for dealing with this well, for achieving your particular goals, because people's goals are different, right? Their risk tolerances are different, right? You have people who are like, they just don't want to get into dark territory because they've got jobs and kids and they can't handle a disruption in their life. They've got debts and they're like, no, 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 no. And you've got other people who are just balls to the wall, gung ho, like plunging in as, they want to plunge to the highest highs and the greatest spiritual depths and crash through it all, with sort of bravado. And then you get people who think they want the one and end up really wanting the other, and think they want this one, and are like, actually, nope, I'm going screaming back to family and job, and like, no, that was too much. I don't, and so you see these oscillations. But what we don't have at the moment is perfect optimized strategies that we're certain can meet with a person's individual goals and risk tolerances, which is one of the reasons for more research, but at least recognizing that there is a range of practices that may be more likely to lead to glory, but also more risk, or more likely to lead to stabilization, but perhaps less dramatic and profound and amazing or challenging effects, right? So one of so if you think about this as like a car, and one of the things is the accelerator for people who really want these effects, right? How do you push faster into this territory and get to the really cool, amazing stuff that people can get into? That's an important part of the car, but also just as important, or more important, are having good brakes where you can slow the thing down when it's going too fast, and recognizing that sometimes braking is a really important thing to do, right? If these openings are teaching their lessons, if you want to look at it from that kind of point of view, a little bit too fast for you to handle it skillfully and not cause harm to yourself or others. And then as well as a steering wheel, right? So being able to steer this into various directions, right? And say, hey, there's this way, and we can tune it for people who really do like the energetic powersy stuff, and we can tune it for people who really do like the insighty, wisdomy, other kind of awakening kind of stuff, or tune it for really soft landings, or tune it for maximum drama. You get these people who that's what they like, how to drive this thing in multiple dimensions, right? Using different techniques, energetic focuses, attentional focuses, diet, exercise, doses of practice, doses of substances. And then the whole question of where does the whole world of pharmacology fit into this, both in terms of speeding it up and slowing it down. These are all complicated questions. And so, yeah, I've just raised a whole lot of issues. I wish I had more answers. But at least knowing that there's a lot of interesting debates out there is really, I think, even more important than someone demonstrating absolute certainty on a podcast where absolute certainty does not exist.
So what did you find most useful in your life, or what do you find useful these days if you're, plunging into some very intense energetic territory? How do you slow it down? How do you stabilize, or what have you found most useful in terms of tools?
Again, these are things I wish we had better science on. So what you're getting, scientific evidence quality, is expert opinion filtered through a hybrid tradition modified by the biased case series of people who have resonated with my stuff and presented to me, just so we have appropriate epistemological underpinnings of what I'm about to say. Filtered through a whole lot of reading of diverse traditions and a sort of a rough perennialism mixed with a clinical pragmatism. Okay, given that's where I'm coming from, what I have found useful, first of all, I would read A Path with Heart, chapters 9 and 10. Actually, the section on naming the demons as well is really good. So this is just useful technology. The books of Tara Springett get recommended a lot. I have not gone through them to the detail I know A Path with Heart, but they get well recommended. You can check out some of the grounding technologies you're going to find in books like the works of Emma Bragdon. But what you're going to find in a lot of these places is maybe practice less or stop practicing entirely. Or if you're going to practice in a much reduced way, open eyes likely is going to lead to better effects than closed eyes, in terms of like slowing the thing down, I think, or expanding it out in a more balanced way. Heavier diets get recommended all the time for good reason. Like, I would love science behind this, but do I think like a heavier, more fat and carb heavy diet rather than something really light with not eating meals after noon, noon and creating more ketones? Do I think the heavier diet of more meals per day and more snacking and stuff is likely to create more grounding? Yeah, I do. Is there great science behind that? No, I wish there was. Making sure you get sleep every night. So like this is critical. Find a way to sleep. Find ways to exhaust yourself through exercise or, that's safe and not hurting your body or, causing you to run into trouble. That way can be very helpful. Normalizing this, find friends and community. So find teachers and people who are grounded and can hold a space for you and yet model also a much calmer way of being and encourage that. Figuring out how to grab the controls of your own energy level. So just like we can figure out how to raise energy in the morning when we want to get up, but we're tired, but we have to go to work and we have to drive in traffic or whatever, we can also figure out ways to calm ourselves down, figuring out where your own internal levers are and how they work in terms of moderating energy level. This is a skill set we can learn and it's definitely cultivatable. Do I find guided meditation sometimes helpful for people? Yin yoga, very helpful. That's a pretty cool technology. Anything where you're focusing on energy centers that are down out of your head. So, like if you were focusing on the nose and the breath or the head or something, like bring the energy down to the abdomen. If you were focusing on the abdomen, do walking meditation, bring it down to your feet. Do I think walking practice is really helpful rather than sitting practice? Yes, I do. Things like digging in the earth, gardening, it gets recommended in like Jack Kornfield's book, A Path with Heart. Do I think these can be very helpful? Yeah. Also, if something's going really haywire, thinking about a kind of a trauma informed perspective, right? So are you touching into some challenging stuff from your own past and the body keeps the score, that kind of stuff, or checking out books like Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Treleaven with Willoughby Britton can be very helpful if there's a trauma component to what's going on, because some of the stuff can get into stuff that can be very triggering for people related to something that has happened to them and are centers that want to try to keep us safe might get re-triggered. And so having those kinds of trauma informed perspectives can be super useful. Yeah, that's kind of like my quick scattergun kind of approach. But if I was actually talking to someone, there's a bunch more that would come out, but it would come out in the context of them, their sensory proclivities, the specifics of what are going on with them, what they've tried that worked and didn't. Like, there's more there. But that's like a quick general blanket things that I think are likely to be useful and hopefully not harmful. Again, not based on great science, but expert case series, basically biased expert case series. What have you found that you found useful?
Yeah, it's a good question because I haven't run into this territory, at least not. Yeah, now I'm doing more retreats that are relational. I guess I haven't sat in intense silence for some time, so my focus has really shifted over the past few years, because I think I focused so much exclusively on meditating in silence for some years. So somehow flipped to the other end. But what I found useful was, yeah, it's those things that you mentioned when you meditate for, I don't know, 12 to 16 hours a day and not sleep so much and then not eat after 12. This tends to I'm more prone to these very high energy, hyper activated states also these days. So what I found is like consciously consciously slowing down everything has been very useful. But it's a problem if you're sitting in a monastery that they don't serve food after midday. And yeah, one of the monks once told me, next time if you don't sleep, take a sleeping pill because I don't want to see you not sleeping for so long. But he didn't have one to give me. So yeah, it can be very tricky to figure out what to do at any time. But if it gets too quick, if it gets too inspired, too much, too high energy, then I tend to slow it down with the walking, with running, with physical exercise. Yeah, doing the opposite of just sitting in silence and in stillness tends to like concentrate the energy further and further and further and further, and this can create these manic states that can be so fun, and yet yeah, they have their crashes afterwards. So that's what I found that was most useful for me, and also not taking the perspectives so seriously. Of course, documenting them, writing them down, figuring it out, and then seeing how they, like everything else, tends to change over time. So
Yeah, journaling, by the way, I think can be helpful for seeing the patterns in ourselves, by the way, also, as you mentioned, documenting. Sorry, go ahead.
noticing how these perspectives will shift and try not to make crazy life decisions, or full disclosure towards people who are not so much experienced with this path and who can find it very confusing. That one moment you're telling them, this is all you want to do in your life, and another moment you switch. This tends to confuse people who are not so familiar with the path, and finding ways to talk about it and to explain to others, as opposed to in ways that are not so dogmatic and not so much using terms that they're not familiar with, something that I found very useful. And of course, a lot of intense physical exercise is what I think a vast majority of people in the world don't do so often. And so this also, yeah. And I think what I found for myself is that after these kind of stages, what tends to come up for me is this, or from people who call me when they look at videos like this, is that they're not looking at their life as a whole, and they're kind of thinking like, okay, there was a man who called me, I think it was a month ago, from this channel. He said, "Oh, I went through this Kundalini Awakening, and now I'm going through the dark night of the soul. Can you help me?" And so then I asked, "What do you do when you wake up in the morning? What's going on in your life?" And I find out he's got no job. He's living in a place, got no friends. They had this one woman that broke up with him, and his life is very agitated. And he was like, when this dark night of the soul thing ends, but then he was missing the fact that his whole life as a whole was, and maybe those two things are related, but there becomes this hyper focus on spiritual states and stages as an explanation for what's happening in the rest of one's life. Whereas these things tend to concurrently occur in ages where those parts of life become more important to develop. Yeah, that's what I noticed.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points, and this brings up three trainings, right? So we've focused a lot on insight and energetic stuff, but all three trainings from a sort of a Buddhist, training framework of training in right speech, right action, right livelihood, and then so the basics of how you live your life, which I would include things like psychology and reasonable vocation and reasonable relationships to other people, making sure that you maintain your physical body and health of your little social circles and community, very important, right? So those as a critical support often get left behind when people focus only on the states and stages, right? And that obviously is a serious problem, as you just mentioned. And I get, like you, I've talked to lots of people who have had that kind of stuff happen to them, hundreds, I don't know, thousands, I'm not sure at this point, where they got into this stuff and it messed up all these other things that were critical supports for their happiness and well-being and their basic level of function, financially, socially, and just as an ordinary human. Um, and so that's a great point. And then the second thing is also the second training, which is related to concentration states. So concentration states meaning the ability to cultivate very positive factors of mind and seclude the mind from hindrances, to be able to push away fear and doubt and restlessness and boredom and sleepiness and all of those, and instead cultivate a sense of happiness and well-being, tranquility, equanimity, joy, these qualities that can be very, as well as other positive qualities like gratitude and patience. Yeah, the focus on very specific qualities, and that set of trainings is often neglected. So what I see a lot of is people who just plunge into the deep end of insight when they really didn't have their life trip that together. They really were not that psychologically together. They really didn't have a good community support network, and they also didn't have good training in cultivating positive states of mind and excluding negative ones. So they're going into this without the foundation of the first two trainings. And traditionally, when you read the books on this stuff, they're all organized with first you get your life trip together and you work on basic ethics and you work on being kind to yourself and others, and excluding negative states of mind or dealing with them skillfully in a more helpful way. And then you stabilize your mind and attention with the training and concentration. You get good at cultivating positive qualities like loving kindness and bliss and peace and happiness, and you get a well-trained instrument. And then you go into the path of insight, and then you use this great foundation of excellent internal and external skills to then support the deconstruction of all of this as a process, right? And you enter into the deeper territory and with that in place. But this is often not how it happens for people, where their life is kind of a mess and they were partying and they took some MDMA and some shrooms, and before they knew it they were deep into this territory, but they didn't have all this territory really well established in a really classical, structured, supported way, which is why these things were often a monastic training, where you would be ordained, so your life is your practice, and it's stripped down and it's simplified, and you would get extreme levels of training and deportment, in decorum, in how to speak, how to act well with poise and dignity, right? And appreciate generosity and have a beneficial relationship to the community, a sangha, right? And then you would learn to stabilize your mind and calm down and be peaceful and clear. And then you would start deconstructing this. Well, given that this is not what happens. And the interesting thing is, most people who are going on insight retreats have never been on a retreat to learn deportment. And, I don't even know if there are any, like, other than monastic ordaining, right? But it's weird, like, that the other two things don't also have intensive retreats for them. There are jhana retreats of how to calm down the mind, but even on jhana retreats, people can get into this territory. They can get into insight territory accidentally. But it's interesting, this emphasis, particularly on intensive training, has just been for insight mostly and a little bit of concentration, and not nearly so much the essential foundations of behavior and reasonable psychology and how to relate to your internal world and then translate it to a skillful relation to your external world and other people before you go into the highly potentially destabilizing wild stuff. Right? This is obviously a serious shadow side to our culture and the way this has been brought forward to us as a tradition.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very interesting to see, having spent, I don't know, done 15 years of these Vipassana retreats. And there was always, of course, I'm very grateful for them. I might do more in the future. I definitely have an idea of doing another 3 month retreat one day. But there's always this, like, going really, really deep, and then, coming out and experiencing the down of coming out from retreat, and all that carries. And recently, having done, I entered a 2 year training that is more relational, but it still has a very deep mystical aspect. Having spent 7 days, and all we did on those 7 days was we meditated 1 hour in silence, and the rest of the time we focused on relational and emotional attunement with other people. And I came out, and the effect on my life has been so great, and so on my ability even to maintain my discipline and different things that I'm doing with my life. And I was very surprised how powerful it was simply to practice more listening and sharing with other people, as opposed to sitting in my own, and cultivating these high states of insight and of concentration.
Yeah, great. So I guess on some previous podcasts, you may have talked already about your dyadic techniques and these kinds of relational techniques, or if you haven't, do you want to talk about those? Because they sound really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a training that I'm doing with a teacher named Thomas Hubel, who focuses on trauma, actually. And so that was more related to how to work with trauma. And so what we focus on is the fact that when we are triggered, let's say, we lose touch either with the inner world or with the outer world. And so if you're listening to a bunch of, sitting in a trio with three people that you're not familiar with, and they share very deep, let's say, stories about their childhood, with their parents, with their mother, with their father, it's much more easy for me in a way to listen to that person, because it's not about me. Okay, this is about something to do with them. And so practicing to maintain this touch with the inner and the outer world in that situation would be easier than, I don't know, listening to your partner when they're getting angry with you and trying to maintain that connection. So there was a lot of that, and a lot of presencing in a big group. So 150 people all listening to one person sharing a traumatic experience. That's a lot of the. Of course, there's a lot of theory, but what we did in practice is that. So listening and sharing at the same time, really trying to maintain this awareness of what's happening inside and outside at the same time.
Yeah, wow, that sounds like really cool training. Exciting. I'm glad you're getting to do that. And yeah, these themes keep recurring in the world I work in, of people who are doing, social noting or these dyadic sort of encounter groups, or it just keeps rising again and again as something that's really, really valuable. Circling, obviously, or even more silent ways of doing stuff like this, or not silent, but related to music, like contact improv, or yeah, five rhythms dance, where you're doing something that's interactive and social, and you're relating to the energy of other people. So many of these social techniques, I think, are so important, definitely. And yeah, you're right when you talk about the people who have become so isolated and they're wondering why they're struggling. And with these would have been, yes, there was the emphasis sometimes on going and becoming a cave or jungle yogi in some remote hut or whatever. Usually that was after a real period of being in community, with everything that being in a community does: eating together, going on begging rounds together, practicing together, discussing and debating together, learning about each other, and training together. That would have happened, that we don't see as much in quite the same kind of way as you would get in traditional monastic training. And so that community element that you mentioned, yeah, just keeps coming up as a really useful adjunct to all of this stuff.
This contrast also in the Buddhist world, that in one sutra there's a place where the Buddha says to Ananda, a sangha is the whole of the spiritual life. Don't say it's just part of it. And then sutras where you have to be alone like a rhinoceros, make yourself an island, and this dharma is not for people who delight in company, but those who delight in solitude. It's very interesting to see these contrasts and saying like, okay, which one is it? And also, I guess in my life, I find like after periods of extreme socializing, I feel like actually now it would be nice to spend a week more focused on being alone. So perhaps it has this aspect of balance in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that natural oscillation and having a life that can tolerate that isolation is so rare, right? Usually we get into kind of a track with a job we have to be at and kids we have to take care of, or aging parents, or debts we have to pay, or bills, whatever it is. And then there's not the freedom to have that oscillation between the silence and the beauty of what silence can bring, and then community and engagement with the world, right? And figuring out ways to make that oscillation more natural. Like I myself have really not had a real break in over 2 years. I've been working very hard on the EPRC project and the charity to support emergence benefactors. And I'm going to take my first real break from that, where I will go almost entirely digitally dark for the first time in over 2 years for 3 weeks, coming up in a little bit, and do a retreat just with two other people. And so I'm super looking forward to that, because again, I've been on the social networking, fundraising, building an organization side of things for a long time, which has been extremely rewarding and amazing, like cool people and doing cool work. And it's really inspiring, but trying to find that balance. And so finally taking 3 weeks off coming up in a little bit, and very looking forward to it, of just going into the colors, the images, the sounds, the states, all the things that cool practice can do. Yeah. And then I'll go right back to trying to make the world a better place for the people who are coming up in this stuff and dealing with Kundalini and all of that. Yeah. Trying to support better science on all of this, and networking the communities that can do that science, and finding the funds that can help support this. So, by the way, if you're interested in the world knowing more about this, and the clinical world knowing more about this in particular, and the public, sorry for a shameless plug for the charity Emergence Benefactors, but it's a registered charity that's designed to help the EPRC to do all the work it needs to do to make the world much better in terms of higher quality evidence for best practices for cultivating the good, avoiding the challenging things depending on what your goals are, and dealing skillfully with the strange.
Yeah, awesome. I think we pretty much covered everything I wanted to talk about with Kundalini Awakening. Obviously, this topic is huge. There's so much we could say, but I think we covered the more essential points and our own perspectives. So for now, I think we could end here. Dr. Daniel Ingram, thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast. And in general, thank you for supporting me in my practice for the past, I don't know, has it been 12, 13, 14 years? I don't even remember. I think it was 2006 when I found you first. So it has been a very long time. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And for the viewers, if you have any other interesting questions, something you want me to explore with Daniel, do put it in the comments below. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. This is fun. Yeah. And again, read other sources, keep your wits about you. Stay in community, find local experts, or on the internet, people who are skillful, people non-exploitative, good people who can help you if you're running into this territory. My best advice. Again, I'm just one person, one set of opinions. So make sure you read broadly, do your research,